Go for it.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another week of Ainslee Hooper Chats with. This week I have with me Ruby Susan Mountford. So thank you very much for coming on, Ruby. And could you please introduce yourself and tell everybody about you?
Of course. Firstly, thank you so much for having me, Ainslee. It's very exciting. My name is Ruby. I use they, them pronouns, and I work in community development, specifically around LGBTQI plus disability communities. I've been involved in a number of projects. It's a pretty new area, but in the last few years, or at least, no, let me check. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's not a new area. It's actually, we've had groups in LGBTI disability since the 70s, as the Gay and Lesbian Archives has found documentation of. However, in the last few years, there's been a number of state and government, federal government sponsored projects that have been popping up, and I've had the great honor of being a part of some of them, including some research projects, one done by Deakin University and Pride Foundation Australia called Ticking the Box about the lived experiences of LGBTI people with disabilities. I also work in disability inclusion at LGBTIQ organisations, and I work in LGBTIQ inclusion with Autism Spectrum Australia and other autistic outreach programs in that space. I also do a bisexual podcast and radio show called Triple Bypass on Joy 94.9, which is the LGBTIQ community radio station here in Australia. And I'm an administrator on the Bypass Community Melbourne Facebook group. And I also currently serve as Vice President of Melbourne Bisexual Network, which is a little incorporated grassroots organisation that does advocacy around multigender attraction and our mental health.
Wow.
Also, I play Dungeons and Dragons a lot.
Nice. Wow, that's so much going on. Yes. You and I were talking earlier about things that you've been doing in the research space. Just tell everyone what you're doing there at the moment, because it's so fascinating.
Yeah, so we're wrapping up on a project that for the last year and a bit, myself and 3 other LGBTIQ people with lived experiences of disability have been working with Dr. Amy O'Shea at Deakin University on a project that is basically looking at gathering qualitative data, so like personal experience of LGBTIQ people living with disability. And so we designed and held focus groups in Metro Melbourne and in regional spaces in Bendigo. And basically the idea for this project was to look at the data we gathered, which was around what our experiences are and where the barriers the patterns that we're seeing insofar as our access of services, our feelings of inclusion and isolation. We have a lot more feelings of isolation than inclusion most of the time, unfortunately. But it also was, I think, a chance to look at the importance of doing research and academic research in these areas in a way that is very heavily inclusive of people with lived experience of what you're studying. I know there's a pretty tumultuous history with the medical and academic fields and disability. And so I think often it can be very othering and objectifying of the people that are being studied. And so I think being part of this project where they were very much conscious of needing to have people with disabilities involved in all levels of the research design, in the project rollout, and in the write-ups thereafter, I think it's that step of really acknowledging the need to be including the communities that you're trying to conduct research on from the very earliest stages, to make sure that your own subconscious biases and the blind spots that can occur, ironically, that's not the right term for it, is it? The spots that, the places that academia still hasn't quite recognized that they are not necessarily that their objectivity is discriminating in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
There's also been some other projects happening in that space. I know that Pride Foundation is looking to release a survey they've done across Victoria that had hundreds of people participating, which is great because we often, and that was around self-advocacy. So LGBTIQ people with disabilities, their connection to community, again, if they have an NDIS plan, if their NDIS providers have ever given them any information about being an LGBTIQ person with disability, they haven't. It's never given, and stuff like that. So I think it's a lot of information is being gathered in this space, because I think as people are starting to become more aware of this intersection, which is a really big taboo area, because people don't like to imagine people with disabilities having sex at all. Let alone having gay sex, right? It's a whole thing. And so we're basically just trying to gather information now so we can better understand the things that we need to shore up and build a more resilient and healthy and happy and connected community within the LGBTIQ disability space. But I think that's leading to a greater understanding across the disability sector in Australia, particularly a lot of the sector that is not necessarily driven by people with disabilities in decision-making roles, that people with disabilities are not all, we have like intersections outside of just being a disabled person, which often I think is means a white guy who's straight. So I think it's been interesting to recognize and to see industries very frantically realize just how far behind they are in understanding our basic individuality. But on the other hand, they are moving quickly to try and remedy that. Some moving more quickly than others. In fact, to say they're all moving quickly was a lie. I apologize, listeners. I didn't mean to lie to you. But some of them are moving quickly. Some of them are moving very, very slowly. But that's, I think, what the work's about.
Yeah. You've raised some really interesting points there. Like, it's just a couple of things I've been thinking of. In regards to disability and sex. I read an article the other day, and it just sort of struck me. So it was an article about a woman who is in her 40s and doesn't have children, and she's so sick of people asking her, when are you going to have children? And I thought to myself, like, I'm looking at all these comments and I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm in my 40s. I don't have kids, and I do not get asked that question at all. I've never been asked that question. When are you going to have kids? It's like, it's always just assumed that, that
you wouldn't, would you? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It's like, I've even had like carers. I've had a couple of times where I've had carers talk about getting pregnant and stuff. And one looked at me and she goes, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, why? She goes, oh, because you can't have kids. And I said, excuse me. I said, I just don't want them, so it's just, it's an interesting space like that.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think like there's a few factors that can happen there. Like there is that I suppose I need to put out like a big content warning. Like I suppose in discussing the ways that like ableism works in society and how insidious it can be quite triggering. So I just want to kind of put our heads out there. But the fact is, I think the majority of people still assume it'd be better if we weren't born. And so therefore the idea that people like us would continue to give birth to children that might be like us is just not conceivable, because why would we want to risk that? Because our lives are so miserable, right? Like it's that sense of, and so I think does that still really, and also like, I think the idea of, I think in some states, I'm not sure exactly, but I know that people with intellectual disabilities can't have kids in some states. It's just like, I think, or at least can't get married. I think I need to look into that a bit more closely, but I know that there's a lot of, like, I have a condition that makes it quite hard for me to be able to get pregnant should I wish to. But for a long time, I thought that was okay, because I still had in my head that it would not be a good thing to have an autistic kid.
Right.
And that was like when I kind of recognized those dots of like, oh, I still internalize these messages that basically say it's probably best if I wasn't like this. And I think that led to a lot of kind of very intense like unpacking of how these kind of internalized fears and erasure really happens. And I think in some ways, because I was part of the LGBTIQA+ community before I knew I was autistic, and before I was diagnosed as autistic and diagnosed with ADHD, I'd already started to have to work quite hard on recognizing how internalized biphobia influenced me, and how internalized homophobia influenced me, and how internalized transphobia influenced me. And it actually gave me a framework to really tackle and understand internalized ableism in that way, which was that we go through periods of denial, we go through periods of self-pity, but like honestly, and that's all still living in that place where we're kind of being dominated by the ableism. And to transcend it, or to move to battle it, is to have self-love and self-care, to give ourselves the breaks that we need, to ask for the things that we need, and to know that it's okay to ask for, but also to support each other, and to be able to reach out to each other and offer support. And finally, transcending internalized phobias and internalized ableism, that's celebration and pride. So finding ways to celebrate ourselves and take pride in ourselves. And I think having that framework there helped, that once I could recognize that I obviously was still having a lot of misgivings about the difficulties I had grown up with as a person who was not diagnosed but was autistic my whole life. and just the difficulties I know that the world still places for people like us, and which don't need to be there. I think it helped me a lot to understand why I felt that way, and what I should be looking to feel instead. And you know, I think pride is a battle. It's much like, I think, you know, it's like hope. Hope is an active verb. You have to be actively hoping. You can't just hold it and wait for it to kind of visit you when it's ready. But I think it's the same with disability pride and disability celebration. It's something that we have to actively decide to do in spite of everything else that we're being told. And I think that was a really powerful thing for me. And I'm really thankful that I could find that and connect those experiences of being a bisexual person and being a non-binary person, and finding ways to celebrate something that the world, again, was just really unsure about. Like, can you just make up your mind and just pick something? So I think having to find a sure sense of self and a very strong sense of identity and celebration in spite of everybody put me in very good stead to be able to reuse those skills and reassemble the toolkit to make it work for my journey for disability pride as well.
Yeah. I just thinking about, like, as you said, like all these labels and changing and things like that. In your experience, okay, so a little bit of a backtrack. I studied anthropology undergrad, and I've gone on to do my honours and stuff. Anyway, one of the fascinating parts of that I've studied was Ian Hacking, and he wrote about making up people, and it was about labels and how people, once labels start to be, so once a label is out there, then more and more people sort of pop up in those labels. So did you find, like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, so did these labels, now that they're existing, did they then just help you to? Yes. Yeah, so you already, you understand what I'm trying to say, right?
I know. So it's the idea of, like, how having the word for an experience and seeing people use that word for their experiences makes it much easier to relate that experience and that word to yourself. Kind of. Yeah, for sure. I think I absolutely agree. And I think I've seen, even in the last few years, the big attitude changes happening in some spaces around neurodiversity and that language being used. And like, when I was told I was autistic, like 5 years ago, it was devastating. Like, I was quite devastated. I felt deeply ashamed. Like, I had just been told despite all my efforts, I was still very weird. It's what I felt like I was being told. And I feel very differently now, but I have friends who recently found out they're autistic, or have sorted out and have been searching for it, and are euphoric. And because it helps them understand their experiences, and they feel like this is something that they can be proud of, and that, you know, explains a lot to them, and also makes them feel less alone. And I think that's something as well, because when that label is something that you see a crowd of people together in and they all look happy, it doesn't feel as scary when you're told you belong there too.
Exactly.
And I also think in that way, labels are like cats, right? If you try and put a cat in a box, it hates it. But if you put a cat in a room full of boxes, it's going to find the ones that fit right. So no, the labels are the boxes and we're the cats. The point is, labels are great when we get to choose them. Labels can be very intense when they're pushed onto us. Which is another thing. But I think as well, I've seen, interestingly, there's a lot of discussion happening around who can call themselves disabled. And like, my choice to call myself a disabled person is something that I chose, again, I think because of my history of LGBTIQ stuff, that awareness of choosing to take on a title or take on an identity is a very political choice, I think. It's like coming out and being like, oh, I'm bisexual. I'm not, you know, I want everyone to know that's important. Or I'm non-binary. That's what I am. And I'm not going to kind of let that be vague. I'm going to be very specific. And I think often, I first realized I didn't want to consider myself to be disabled, because a lot of people were trying to find ways to separate myself from what I saw as a very terrifying thing, because I had not had a lot of exposure to people with disabilities. I had what the media told me, which is that sad, real sad, just always sad. And sometimes they can buy milk for themselves. Incredible. You know, and just when I think back on that, just the inner cringe and frustration I feel, But I think by choosing to say, no, well, I have these conditions that and differences that are definitely not accepted by society, and that definitely create a lot of shit in my life. And as much and and I feel that gives me a connection and a sense of community with people who have different backgrounds in that space, people with hearing impairment or deaf and like vision impairment, and people who use mobility aids. Like it's we all have like disability. It's different, but we're all different in different ways, but we all have the same experience of being different in that way. So it's and it also gives me a sense of purpose in knowing that like the history of disability activism is incredible. It's honestly what our communities have done and how far people have managed to get us to go. It's awe-inspiring, and as much as inspiration can be a bit of a weird word for us.
Oh yeah, insert porn.
Well, exactly, but like it's that sense of when it's our own communities, like basically, and again, like that similar experience of looking and reading into LGBTIQ history and just knowing that everything I can enjoy as someone who can be proudly out and open and obnoxiously bisexual at times, which usually just means being awkward around everyone of every gender, but also but wearing a cool jacket while I do it. That's the whole that's bi culture, baby. But yeah, it gives me a lot of pride in that sense. But I also know people who live with chronic pain who don't want to call themselves disabled, often because they are scared they feel like it takes away from other people's experiences. And I think that's still a problem, where there's still a perception, rightly so, that there is a very limited amount of sympathy for people with disabilities, and that anyone else choosing to take on that title might be taking away from that very finite, pie of sympathy. Well, I think what I believe is that the more we can get that sense of a lot of us have to live with things that are disabling, and that the more of us who are open and feel confident to express that, the more it will be taken seriously. Because much like we've seen in the pandemic, like a lot of the changes that have been made to flexible working, to working from home, to video conferencing, to holding on online events have been things that people with disabilities have been asking for and trying to organize for a very, very long time. And so all it took was the majority needing it. And I think it's that sense of, if there's enough people who are kind of, if it becomes that everyone knows somebody with disability who has had to work through something, maybe that's naive of me, but I do believe that the more of us that are happy to openly talk about being a person with disability and really make people understand that their perception of it is wrong, and that they have to widen what they believe a disability is.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think the better, and the more we'll have the chance to be able to be seen as people first and explain our own situation, then have people make a lot of assumptions about what we can, and specifically about what we cannot do.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that, because for me, and I've talked about this a lot, it's this part of it's been a new thing for me. So even though I was born with a disability, because of the whole medical model of disability, I was very much, even though I've been in a wheelchair all my life and it's blatantly obvious that I've got a disability if you see my wheelchair, I hated that label of being disabled, like just absolutely hated it, because I didn't want to be put in that box. But when I look back at it, I was still, regardless of whether or not I liked it, I was still being put in that box. And so certain things happened that directed my life in a particular way up until now. And so it's only been, and so the whole people would go, oh, why don't you do this, and it's like they were basically saying, why don't you do this, just because it had a label of disability or disabled. And I'm like, I don't want to do that, just because I have a disability doesn't mean I should want to have to do that kind of thing. And it's only been since I've really understood, like begun to know the social model of disability, and it's not me that has the disability, but it's the society that's causing the things with my condition to be disabling. That totally just was a huge mind shift for me.
Like it just I can't, like, I just think that theory becoming prominent, like because that's the thing with the medical model, right? It's that disabled in a lot of ways implies a lot of fault. you're disabled.
Yes.
You know, and the medical model by its nature focuses on all the things that are wrong with us, or at least that, you know, that don't match what people expect. And I know that that's, you know, and I think it's the same with, you know, we talked about when I discovered the neurodiversity paradigm theory, you know, that it would make sense for, much like we have biodiversity, it would make sense that human beings would evolve with a certain levels of neurodiversity as a naturally occurring thing.
Yeah.
So saying, you know, things like ADHD and even things like, you know, borderline personality disorder and bipolar and ADHD and as well as autism, they're all actually like they are parts of just human fluctuation. And that can be very difficult because they are not the main part of fluctuation. And so it's not, things aren't built. So I agree. I think finding out about this model that said it's not like, what is disability? Disability is living with things that general society is not adjusted for. You know, that's really what disability is. And
I was absolutely gobsmacked when and it's weird, like, you know, people who don't have a disability probably think that, you know, we should have already known this, but it's just because we've been for me.
Oh, because they know it.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, and it's for me, like, I mean, for me, it's like I'm trying to think of how to word it, but yeah, basically, all up until the whole notion of the social model of disability, it's been like, okay, so because of your disability, you're not going to be able to do this, so therefore you're going to have to do this. So it's all been about directing me in a particular way to get around the world, as opposed to, okay, what do we need to change out there? Or, you know,
what would make your life easier?
Yeah, exactly right. And for some reason, that was never like, I mean, it sounds
it sounds strange now, doesn't it? And I
does.
It is because, like, it's difficult because I think the issue is that because a lot of these institutions and theories do come without much input from people with disabilities. And also, I think there was just that sense of, wouldn't we want to be like everybody else if we could be? And if we can't be, and like, I think this also goes back to, like, you know, in the US and the UK and even in Australia, you know, that we had these things like the anti-begging laws, which basically was specifically to stop people with disabilities from being seen in public.
Right.
So, you know, like, and they continued in some states in the US into the 70s. And I think, so people got very used to us just not being there. And they just assumed that we wouldn't want to be, because we wouldn't want to be reminded of all the things that we can't have, as opposed to, well, why couldn't we have these things? But I think that it's still taking such a long time for people to have recognized how to do things like in like supported decision making, and how to give us the agency to show what we're capable of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without us having to be exceptional to be treated like mediocre. You know, at the moment, it still does take people with disabilities working exceptionally hard for recognition. And I think, like, you know, I think that's also, you know, the big sense of privilege is like, who gets to be mediocre and still be okay. And it's difficult. But I think the social model also, I know that it's, I think, helped make the topic a lot different, but also help people take action, because the medical model was also, in some ways, it felt like it was kind of like a pseudo-religious model as well, because people want to believe in like a just world where things are like done fairly, and disability doesn't really work with that. So there's that sense of like, well, if you're disabled, then something must be wrong with you or your family, maybe. So you should take care of that yourself. That shouldn't be our problem.
Yeah, it'd be like, what do we need to do to make you it's all about treating you as opposed to, treating the individual as opposed to treating the systemic and societal problems that
and so as a result, and I think, you know, as we know, that's interventionalist, and as we know from, like, it's a very colonialist way to look at things. It's to assume that without understanding or living with the people you're working in, that your way is automatically going to be better by theirs, just from the fact that it's your way.
Yes.
And that theirs doesn't work. And I think it doesn't work. It entrenches feelings of helplessness and isolation and marginalization. It is patronizing as all heck. I have a lot of feelings about it. And I honestly do think in countries like Australia, which was really founded on deciding that some people were more people than other people, it's hard to, like, it's so deeply entrenched to have a hierarchy of who's human. Like, you know, in this country. It's what we were founded on. Like we were founded on deciding that everyone who'd already lived here wasn't actually a real person. And I think that kind of mentality shows that humans find it, humans do other each other. And in some ways, as though, like, as someone who has an invisible disability, there's that flip side of people just not believing me or really not taking accommodation needs very seriously, because they are coding me as someone like them first. And so when I ask for things that they don't need themselves, there's a sense of like, well, you don't actually need that because I don't need that, and you look like me.
Yes.
And I think that's always been an interesting thing as well, because it's a privilege in a lot of ways to not have to counteract the way people will instantly assume I'm less capable if they attach autistic to my name, which I make a point of doing. My resume makes it very clear I am professionally autistic in some ways. But it does mean that I go in there knowing that I will be that it will reset expectations if that's on the table. Or that as well, that because I don't have a visible disability, I can kind of use that to infiltrate, which is hard, but it's like, that sense of if I can get through a crack in the door, I can then throw the door open and everyone else can come in. But it's difficult because it's not picked up on. And so, for the first 25 years of my life, I just had that sense that there was and it was similar to the medical model in that way, if there was no one to blame for things going wrong but myself. So, a lot of feelings of just worthlessness and just fear. And like, because it wasn't working, and I couldn't understand why things didn't work, why I couldn't make friends without it being this huge effort, why I got so overwhelmed, why I was so sensitive, and all these words that were really negative. And so I just had very negative opinions about myself. I still have to work on those, having them, because it still kind of pops up in my head a lot. And it's a really common thing, autistic folks particularly, because invisible social disabilities really come at that point of like just being an outcast, like being alone in a crowded room, I think is the best way to look at undiagnosed autism. It's lonely. It's really lonely. And I think I think social media has done a lot for disability in general, because I think being a disabled person has been very lonely for a very, very long time. Because we're not deemed fit for public view. Or if we are, it's in a very specific way where it's to try and make other people who are able-bodied and neurotypical feel better about themselves or feel motivated to do something, because if we can do it, they can definitely do it. Like, it's which is always really wild to me, that sense of like, well, if someone with disability can do it, what's your excuse? It's just like,
and that's always made me cringe, like when I've been used as an example, and it's just like, oh my god, I want to crawl into a hole because I feel so sorry for that person that's just been.
I went to school where we, like, in primary school, we had a guy who'd been in an accident, was in a wheelchair, just coming to tell us his life story, to kind of like inspire us about overcoming adversity. Like it's bizarre, right? Like it's that.
I've never understood it. Even like seeing it myself, I'm just like, why am I not as cheery as that person?
Well, like a part of it's just like, it's trying to teach us to have compassion, but the fact that they still do it in this quite othering way of like, like, here's a compassion figure for you to kind of, understand and work through. It's still, I think that's the difference between the medical model and the charity model, right? Which is like very much the charity model, which is just like, oh, those poor dears. Oh, so sad. You know, and it's, and I think that's often where a lot of people can then become stuck with, because they don't kind of recognize that the charity model often still comes with that kind of assumption of like, well, we know, we'll take care of you. It removes a lot of agency. And I think it's difficult to kind of recognize that it's still very disabling to have your choices taken away. It's interesting. I think the fact that the social model is being talked about now, like the fact that organizations are starting to take the fact that like almost no one has a disability inclusion policy, that's starting to kind of get picked up on now, though. You work in that space, so you know about that.
That's the thing. The space that I work in is I've been using that. It's funny, I've been using that hashtag on LinkedIn a lot, disability and inclusion, but I don't actually work in that space. However, it's only just become clear to me in the last month or so about that particular space and how lacking it is. I'm like, I was gobsmacked. I thought, well, there's diversity inclusion, so gender, race, blah blah. but disability seems to be so vacant from it. And when I don't know if you saw, I asked on LinkedIn, why is this? And people said that they're scared to actually touch disability. So that to me was just like, wow, I can't believe that we're so far, that, like as you said about the disability rights movement has come so far, and yet we're still so scared. But like the other thing as well, disability action plans, I can't believe that those are still not enforced. So what's the point of an organisation having a disability action plan if nothing,
there's no accountability for it?
Yeah, what is that? And that's just, to me, as a person with a disability, I find that just completely, I feel really gross when I feel gross.
We get used, and like it's like that sense of kind of like wheeling someone out and being like, look how good I am.
Yes, yeah.
It's the charity model. And I think like I've just, one of the projects I had the pleasure of working on, which was like a co-design project that was looking at inclusive, like how to create inclusive culture, was specifically talking about like, you know, publish this on your website. People should be able to see what you've promised so they can hold you to your promises. Because otherwise, why are you doing it? Like, why are you actually doing this if you don't want it to be done well? And I think that you mentioned before, so people feeling overwhelmed. I think there is that sense of it can, much like people get overwhelmed by just, oh my God, but there's so much. And it's that sense of, like anything, sure, it's a learning curve, but we've had them before. You know, we continue to have them. We have training around anti-racist behavior. We have training on like, you know, how to be more like culturally sensitive to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have cultural training about LGBTIQ awareness, but like people still find like that sense of disability awareness, because disability is such a broad area to be like, just people still find that, I think, also just really confronting, because as I was saying before, they're just really used to us not being part of the conversation.
Exactly.
And I think,
and that's it.
That's still,
I think and that's it, like we are here. So that's what we're wanting. We're wanting to be included in that. So all people need to do is just actually search for people who are interested in helping you do that work. And when I say helping you do that work, not helping in regards to unpaid gigs, because I've seen so many of those, like, but actually, employing or using consultants, people with disabilities who are consultants to do that work, because, I'm just, it's such a, I guess, for me, I'm just like, I think of disability awareness training, and we've had it for so long, but it's just like, I don't know where I'm just,
it makes sense. Like, I think there's a lot of frustration there in that, that there has been this stuff and people have wanted it, but they haven't even known where to go. But I think that's all just because, you know, a lot of, as someone who was not born and like, you know, who was identified with having a disability at birth, and so was not part of the systems that existed around disability, it can be really mind-boggling to understand them. And like, you know, I've had friends who only in the last few years, through doing work in projects, have realized that disability service providers and disability advocacy organizations are totally different. You know, like that, and like that, and how you'd access about what and for why. Like these are all kind of quite. There's not an information book you get of like, so you're disabled. Here's some stuff you should know. You know, here are the laws that protect you. I'm actually, you know, as part of one of our projects at Thorn Harbour, we're trying to make that information. Just because it's that sense of, if you don't know what, you know, it's hard to know where to start. And also for organizations, like, you know, I know that they also just kind of like, oh, where do we look for disability access training? And like, is it just we ask somebody that we know to come in and talk to us, or like, do we? And I think there's still that and then still like it still becomes this kind of sense of, because for a long time our ability to be part of the workforce has been quite difficult. There's a lot of barriers insofar as well of like seeing us as being capable of doing like high level training. And and it's I think it's also interesting just because there is this new, I do think that there is a new push. Like, you know, we're seeing things like, you know, I watched the grand final last night. It was a weird experience having it in Brisbane because I'm in Melbourne and we've been in lockdown for over 100 days and they stole our grand final and it was on at night and it was weird. But they had like a lot of there was a lot of Auslan interpretation during like commentary and stuff like that, and people have been like checking out the Auslan interpreters for Dan Andrews' press conference, Premier Dan Andrews, and so there's been this kind of like normalizing of it being a expected part of any communication.
Yes,
and I think, and I think it's that sense of why disability can feel so overwhelming at first, because people just have no idea of where to start, because they can't imagine how we could fit into the system. And the issue is like the earlier, and like they think they have to change all their stuff at the edges, and it's like, well, if you just start earlier and like from the beginning, just see this as part of what you're doing, it isn't as difficult. It's just that when you have already constructed something that isn't accessible, and then you try to make it accessible,
exactly,
you'll have a really rough time, because we won't trust it and we won't show up, and then you'll be like, well, no one even cared. And
exactly,
it wasn't our problem. It wasn't our fault that you didn't include us from the beginning, and it's not our fault that we don't appreciate being an afterthought. And if we're not turning up, it's important to ask why we're not there, as opposed to assume it's because we've chosen to opt out. We very rarely choose to opt out of things. If we're not there, it's because something has stopped us from being there.
Exactly right. It's like, when it perpetuates that idea of, well, we're not seen, so therefore we must not be interested in going in those spaces, that kind of thing. Because like it was just, it had me in thinking before, talking about the diversity and inclusion side of thing, because like, as I said, like I didn't realize, I knew nothing about the D&I space until recently. Excuse me. So for me, diversity and inclusion was just a bit about disability being included in a diversity group, and sort of like getting that, because like we were talking earlier, it feels like we're sort of getting more of that conversation going, whereas it wasn't seen before. But I'm going off track a bit now. I seem to start to waffle on when I start to get really like I think about certain things, and my anger starts to rise a little bit, because I just think of like, I get frustrated, because this is the thing, like as you were saying, you see on press conferences like the sign language, and so there's all this sort of portrayal in the media that things are accessible or inclusive, but it's kind of like there's this gap. It's like you can see it on your TV, but there's a gap between the TV and the. Do you think there's a gap between the TV?
Oh, yeah, no, of course. Like I think, and I think as well, like it's there's a big gap between what we're still living with, for sure. And a big gap around awareness in that space. And like, I think, and even in different states, insofar as who's doing what in these spaces. And I was thinking about what you're saying, like, waffling on the other factors that I find at least, that we rarely kind of get a space where we can express anger, where it's not potentially risky for us to do so. Like to actually be able to just sit there and be like, can I swear on this?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
It's really fucked. It's real fucked. And like be able to say that to someone who understands exactly what I mean and agrees is quite uncommon. And often in the work that you do and the work that I do in like capacity consultations, in a sense of being like, all right, that's great. It sounds like you're really learning. This is this is a safe place to learn, to ask questions. Oh, you've never heard of that term before? No worries. And him and I just being like, I know that we're all on a learning journey, but I'm very tired, and I've only been doing this for a few years. Like I can't imagine what it. And I think there's that sense as well of it's always dangerous to express anger about something that most people in the room are not feeling, because they don't. Because your anger just seems like you're being because it just makes your anger seem like you're being irrational, or you're being like unreasonable, or you're being too demanding. And I think those are all things that, like, particularly like the stereotypes around autism and like how we're supposed to respond, like the real impacts of that, like that a lot of women, like I think they found some studies in the UK show that autistic women were more likely to lose their kids in child support because they were seen as argumentative. A lot of autistic people who are not white don't get labeled as autistic. They get labeled as having oppositional defiance disorder, which is basically just the most a way to say they're arguing with people that we don't think they should argue with, is basically what that means. And which is almost everybody if you're a person of color too, let's be honest. Like, you're not supposed to argue with anybody. You're supposed to never be upset or cross, even if there is everything in your life is unfair.
Yeah.
And I think there's the same sense with disability, and it's the same sense with LGBTIQ plus stuff as well, right? Like, you can't get angry. You've got to like police your own tone so much. And I think when we're able just to talk together in spaces, it can become very heated just because of how much we are all holding on to. And that self-censure that we have to go through, and that kind of careful disclosure, and often like emotional regulation, like, you know, checking if we're getting frustrated and pulling ourselves back down, or like, you know, if we're feeling tired and want to ask for something, trying to size up if they're likely to see that as us being problematic or us causing a fuss, or like not being like tough enough to hack it out. Like, there's all these calculations that we have to do all the time just to make sure that we are not putting people offside. And I think that often means that we hold on to the rage and the resentment, and so it can like, you know, it can come up in that it's unjust, you know. And they often say, like, autistic people, we talk about like having, I feel like, injustice as an emotion, like, you know, where it's just kind of like very strong, intense, like physical response to what I see as things that are unjust and unfair. And I think that tends to, when we can come together, and again, often we're still really meeting each other through these advocacy spaces, right? Like, that's still often a lot of our social networks is advocacy. And I think like it often means that we do have this kind of top-down understanding of all these barriers, but often are facing them alone or explain them to people who don't live with them. So I think having those moments of kind of camaraderie of just like, yeah, it's fucked, mate. It's fucked. It's just it's really comforting and really vital, I think, to us.
Yeah. I love that you've spoken about anger, because like, I guess when I go quiet and I can't word things properly, it's because I had this anger burning inside of me. And there have been times where, you know, I've tried to voice certain things that have been unjust, and people are just like, oh, just settle down, you know, it's not that bad. And it's like, excuse me, like these. And then this is where my internalized ableism kicks in. They're like, oh, it's not that bad. And so I'm just like, okay, so therefore they must be right, because, you know, I've always been the one that's
asked for special treatment.
Yeah.
Is that how it could feel?
Yeah.
Like, I know that's how it's felt for me.
I've been the one that's had to ask, oh, excuse me, can I have this? Can I have that? And I guess felt like the imposition.
Yes,
you know,
feeling like a burden is the fucking worst thing in the world. Like, it is. And I think it's so hard to explain just how it permeates almost all parts of our lives, because it is what a lot of the time media and messaging will make us feel. Like, and this is a whole thing, like, you know, and I can only really speak, again, I can only speak from my own experiences. And like, I you know, I do disability advocacy, but I'm an autistic person. So the autistic space is what I know best. But the issues that we have there, insofar as all this messaging that focuses on parents and the cost to parents of being of having autistic children, and all this focus on supporting parents, and all these organizations led by parents and carers, and it can be that sense of, it's much easier for the average person to relate to the parents because they're not autistic. And so you've managed to find ways of supporting everyone around the autistic person. But when it comes to mental health support for a population of people that have shockingly high self-harm and suicide rates, you know, our life expectancy is still 55 years.
Wow.
You know, it's and often that's because of self-harm and suicidality. And despite this, often even the big organizations, most of their resources and everything is putting on to getting us to fit into the workforce. It's not about our mental health. It's not about building, you know, adult supports. It's not about what it is like to live our lives. It's about how we can be best fit into what people will observe about us. How do we best, how do we best, like, you know, get us to find a way to work in the system, even if it is really constantly reminding us that we're not right, and that we have to keep asking, and that And I think like but on the other hand, like when I've had experiences where that has gone, when people have asked me, or when my friends remembered to bring earplugs and we went out and I'd forgotten mine and they had spare earplugs just in case I needed them. Or I went for a job and they were just like, do you have any access requirements? And I was like, yeah, I need this. Like, okay, cool, here you go, done. Like those little things make such a difference. Like when you can tell people have recognized that not everyone who applies or walks through their door is going to have the same needs and requirements, when you can tell that they've already recognized that they shouldn't make that assumption, it makes a big difference to me. I think if more people can recognize that no one should assume that everyone has the same experience as you or experiences the world the same way as you, the better. Like that just if anything can happen, just that 1 second of just ask, not assuming you know what somebody needs, not assuming that you know what they need or what they don't need, just and asking them, because you don't impose help, you ask. It's like, the woman, she put like spikes on the handles of her chair. She's like, stop pushing my chair without asking me. So she just put spikes on the handles because she was just like, I don't need that help. That's not asking what I need. That's assuming what I need, because you're just like, oh, person in a wheelchair, let me help you, And she was just like, I have agency. Look at these guns. I can do it myself. It's fine. And I know that, for me, there's a difference between being patronized and being supported. There's a big difference in those two things. And yeah, I've seen more proactive support. And like I got to do a program with Autism Community Resource Center, and like, they sent out all the information for all of us. They were asking what color combinations would be best for us to read them through, because just dyslexia and different things can work better with different color combinations. Or Inclusion Melbourne, like there's a lot of work in creating easy and simple English translations for government sheets and everything. Like Rainbow Rights, like the LGBTIQ peer support group for intellectual disabilities, like their president, Cam Bloomfield, has like been helping them to directly translate all the ways that they can communicate the restrictions happening because of the pandemic in ways that are understandable for people with intellectual disabilities. But I think that and that's still a whole other, I'm tangenting a bit now, but I think even as we move through with disability access, like the intersections of that, like we still are very quick to often, I know when I was first diagnosed, when I was first found out I was autistic, there was a big need to separate the idea of being autistic from having an intellectual disability.
Right.
And I still think that there is a huge lack of agency and visibility for people with intellectual disabilities. And that's still an area where, whenever we assume that, like whenever we talk about someone having like the mind of a 6-year-old, whenever we basically find all these ways to say that you have to have a certain IQ to have agency, it's deeply dangerous. And I still think that's something that we haven't really reckoned with as even in the disability movement. Like we haven't really reckoned with the racism that's in our movements, and that we don't, like that our disability movement is often really white, or at least led by white people. And I think that, and also the cultural differences in how disability is talked about, understood. I think it's still a big difficulty there. But I know that with intellectual disability specifically, like I still think it's one of those areas where it is so ingrained in us to see people with intellectual disabilities as being the epitome of like, well, surely this is not worth living. And I feel that is so entrenched and so deep in people that it's so hard to recognize when everything has told you otherwise. And I think that's part of it as well. But it's so important to recognize that a person can have a good life without needing to achieve what we've decided is what makes you worth having a good life. And I think that's really the best way of putting it. But like if you can support, we can be, as long as words like stupid and dumb are seen as like jokes or are seen as inherently negative, as long as we do kind of correlate intelligence with worthiness and productivity with worthiness, and all those things are so aligned. So when the disability movement itself is ableist against people with intellectual disabilities or against each other, we enforce this idea that there will be gatekeeping, that there will be someone deciding who can be supported and who won't be, or who shouldn't be. And I think it's really dangerous, I think, to not really assess that you can have a disability and you can still be an ableist person. You can understand your own access needs, but not have any sympathy for other people's. And if you're not really understanding where that defensiveness comes from and where maybe like impatience can come from. If you're not consciously checking on that, you're still going to be perpetuating everything that we've been told, like, you know, we should think about ourselves. And it will often come from that place of, well, as long as if I can just hold myself here, as long as I'm not there, I'll be okay. And it should be that no matter where you are, you're okay. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. That was a bit rambly, but you know, you get my idea, I hope.
There's so many, oh my God, my brain's going so many points in there that I just absolutely want to, like, oh man. But like, one thing I was thinking of was, now I'm just trying to gather it. It was, in regards to, talking about the handbook thing earlier. You know how you were saying about we don't get given a handbook. It's interesting, growing up when I was in, say, in primary school, it was sort of, it was kind of like being in that, like in the education department at that age and lower, you were sort of, so I've got the condition spina bifida. So I was involved in this spina bifida clinic from like, you know, when I was a kid. And so basically you'd go to this clinic and you'd have all your supports, like you'd go see your doctors, physios and whatever. And then once you got to high school, you sort of, that lapsed. So then you're basically on your own. And so
that idea that we don't grow up is still like so heavy, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I got to a point when I was in my 20s and I had a medical, not a mishap. It was a negligence in hospital that resulted in me having an injury which went on for a long time. And basically resulted with me being in hospital for about a year, like on and off for about a year. And my doctor, who I ended up with, he's a great guy, and like I credit my life to him because I was in such a bad place mentally because of it all. In the end, he was basically, okay, if you're going to go home, you're not coming back in this time. So we're going to make sure that you got all these supports available. And so he said to me, who's your case manager? And I'm just like, what's a case manager? And I'm like, and so I opened up to this world of all this stuff that I didn't even know was available to me. Like, it probably would have made things a bit easier if I'd known about these things earlier on.
Probably, right?
Yeah.
Like, probably. Like,
and then, that, like, I was 27 at the time, or around then. And when it was introduced to me, I was just like, I mean, okay, so now I realize it would have made things a hell of a lot easier. Back then, when those things were introduced to me, I was just like, don't want to know anything about these supports whatsoever, because having those supports meant that I was more disabled, and I did not like that idea of being more disabled because I had to have these supports.
Do you think, it's
and
like
it's
defining ourselves by struggling, hey?
Yeah. It's like, you know, I've lived my life from here to here without these supports. Why the hell should I need these supports now? Because of what happened to me wasn't my fault. But yeah, now I look back, because, like, you know, that was like 18 years ago now, and I look back and I think, well, if I'd had those supports all along, it would have been a hell of a lot easier. But it's just interesting.
Part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have that, like, I know, like, when I was finally making a few breakthroughs with my mental health and like, particularly like my childhood and my school years, which I just really had a lot of blocks about because it had been a really, really rough time. It was that sense of, if I have to acknowledge that it wasn't my fault, it means I have to acknowledge that it shouldn't have happened and that it was unfair. And I find that that's really hard, you know, like, to acknowledge that you didn't have to have gone through that without supports, that you should have had supports, but you didn't. I think that's actually, like, really hard. And in some ways, by saying, well, no, if I keep on showing I didn't need them, I will have justified that I didn't get them, and I will have, like, shown that, you know, and I think there's that strange sense of it shouldn't have had, really accepting that it shouldn't have had to be like that, and that it wasn't fair. You know, like I said before, we all want the world to be just, And at least, you know, I think we all have different moral codes about it, but I think we all kind of do want to believe that there is like, you know, some sense of justice. But but I think it's so hard just to accept that no, it's not your fault, and it shouldn't have been that hard. And then that's it. And like, and that it is going to be easier now. But you had to go through a lot that wasn't easy, and you shouldn't have had to do that, because look at what we can do with that now. Like you know, again, like this is something that we talk about a bit with LGBTIQ stuff. Like as we see things each generation get a bit easier, like people I think often will forget that, sure, we can still be just flat out murdered in like 22 countries. You know, it's still deeply unsafe. In every country in the world does kill people for being queer. Whether or not, like, you know, that's still where we're at. Whether it's like, you know, directly or indirectly, we still are kind of our existence, and whether we should be able to exist without violence is still debated all the time. And I think there's similar stuff with disability, like our existence and if we should exist is always debated openly, and often without much of our inclusion. And so I think that as things do get better, there is like, our experiences are so different that, you know, when I talk to people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex, who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, their lives have been so different, and they were in a lot of ways so much harder. And so for them to reconcile with how things have improved now, it can be hard, because it has to, and to not resent it, and to not resent the experience people get to have now. Like, you know, as like they're now diagnosing a lot more AFAB and, like, you know, assigned female at birth people and girls with autism spectrum disorder much earlier than they, and like, you know, but that being said, and I felt like at 25 I missed out on a lot. I know people who got diagnosed in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s, you know, and again, by that point you've lived your life just assuming that you're the problem, and it's hard. And it shouldn't have had to be that way. And, you know, and so how we kind of come to terms with that, and it's just a matter of letting ourselves grieve for it, and actually acknowledging that we were kind of that it wasn't, actually accepting that it wasn't within our control is very hard. And accepting that, and that's the crux of saying it wasn't our fault. It also means it wasn't within our control. And I think we really like to believe that somehow it still was, due to our own choices or due to things that we did, because that's a bit easier to accept than just that it really wasn't.
And that's it, because I mean, like I've I've got my own business, which I'm like finally doing something I love, but like from
Ainslee Hooper Consulting.
Yes, oh my God, I'm just like finally. So because basically for me it was like, okay, so you've got a disability, you're going to do this, you can't do this, and so I ended up in a job that, sorry for any ex-co-workers listening to this, but it was a job that I was not happy with, and for 20 years I did that job, and I thought it was me, just, you know, and that was like, you know, the sucky life that I was going to have, just not enjoying it. And now I realize, I look back and like finding ableism and realizing what I went through was ableism, and it was, and that's the guilty part. The hard part about that is that the people who were responsible for you know, directing me on that path, they weren't bad people. They just thought that's what you did. That's what the expectation was. And so it's hard to go, oh my God, well, like, you know, because of all that, this is what's happened to me. You know, but, and so so it's like it's hard to talk about it, because you don't want to blame people. And I don't blame people. It's just that's what that was. You know, they didn't know better.
They made choices with the information they had. And that's the issue, isn't it? Because like when ignorance hurts us, and it does all the time. Like it all the time does. And I think that's, again, it's this extra lump of emotional work we have to do all the time when people are ignorant around us. Like when I've been in an Uber driver, and when I've been in an Uber and the driver's been talking about, just like I mentioned I worked in disability, and he just tried to go off about, like, is it true that they can have kids? I've heard they do sterilization. I heard that you can cure autism with camel milk. All of a sudden, me just sitting there in the car, just being like, I can't. I mean, I don't know what to say at this point because, like, I'm part of the group that you're talking about. What you're saying is so deeply upsetting that you also don't know any better. You're not a bad guy. You just have no clue what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the things coming out of your mouth are just honestly so wrong and come from these really harmful places. That the fact that you can say all of that without any kind of awareness or intention, and very big surety that I'm going to be on your side with it, is exhausting because I can't respond to you. And I think it's exactly like that. It's like, I don't think he's a bad guy. I just don't think that he knows many people with disabilities.
Exactly.
And like, I think it's often like that, isn't it? Because I think I have that sense of, once people have been told, then it's their responsibility. But at the moment as well, we don't really have systems that encourage people to do any learning themselves. Like, unless like neurodiversity and disability is still like a specialized unit in a lot of medicine. And so, a lot of doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists haven't really had a lot of, like, unless they choose to do specialized work, will not get basics on how to provide good health support for people who are neurodiverse, people with disabilities. Like, that's not a part of their training.
That's disgusting.
Anymore. I think it's that sense of that it's that understanding that we are a siloed community and that we only go to very specific spaces, that we don't just occur in the wild naturally, that we're only in these very specific spots. And it's that sense of disability being so other, that the idea that you could just have patients that have some kind of disability as well as a bunch of other things is just like not quite part of it. And it's the same with like, LGBTQI stuff. Like, you don't get inclusivity training based as a standard. Like, they're starting to do better with that, but it's not like it's just that sense of using an intersectional lens is still such a new thing. That sense of the multiple identities that we carry will have a direct impact on how we go through the world and how the world responds to us. And that will play on our mental health. Like, the idea of blaming mental health on societal pressure, not the person, is still a very new thing, like. And it's only when we've got all these studies, like, showing, I think some of the big first ones were on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders communities. It was showing the ongoing effects of marginalization on mental health. Turns out it's not good. It's not good. It's just bad for your brain to make you feel like you're a bad person all the time. Who could have possibly guessed? But now there's proof, So I think, like, the way that that's really seen as is still, people don't have to think about disability unless they choose to. And I think that's the thing that really, I'm not sure if I started off trying to make this point, but that's the point I'm ending on. The fact that, people should be taught around understanding disability and disability access, and be around people with disabilities from any age. And I think just kids learning people can be different is like, it should be pretty basic, and it's not. And I think that, I remember when ages ago, I did an interview on Triple J's The Hookup about dating when you're autistic. And they posted like an article about it. It was very cute, but people were just tagging their friends being like, lol, jokes, you're autistic. And it's like, I get it. It's like that schoolyard thing of being awkward and weird. I get it. However, you're still all making it really clear that it's not something that you'd want to be. And you don't understand that that's really because you haven't really had many positive autistic people around in like, any parts of your life. But I also get to meet like I've helped out with this group called Different Jennies, which does social events for autistic people. And they've been setting up some specific ones for LGBTQI plus people. And it won with like a bunch of like younger kids. And there was like an 11-year-old, and she was just like, all the best people are autistic. Everything, I'm sitting there just being like, you're like surety of just how rad it is to be an autistic person blows my brain. And I'm so happy I could and will cry a little bit because I have a lot of feelings about this. Like, the fact that this is something that you can see characters, like, she was talking about characters she likes in media, because now they have, shows like Steven Universe and She-Ra, Princesses of Power, have canonically autistic characters, who are not shown as people who have to change to find friends. It's really different.
It's like Bob's Burgers. Do you watch that? Louise. It's not explicitly said, but I'm thinking that with the hat that she wears,
there's some definitely
there are traits in there,
neurodiverse traits in there.
Yeah.
And I think like you know, and that's the first step. It's much like how before we got a lot of queer representation, we got a lot of queer baiting, like Supernatural and stuff. Like you have people kind of starting to hint at people being a little like neurodiverse specifically often, but without using the labels of it just yet, because they don't, it feels a bit weird. And
so,
I think that's,
sorry, Supernatural, are you talking about Charlie?
I'm talking about in Supernatural how they were kind of queer baiting with Dean and Castiel for a really long time.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, like documented season after season of being like, will they, won't they? Well, we'll never tell, but they're not gay, but maybe they will.
Yeah.
And just never going anywhere with it. It's cool. It was that sense of like, you know that your fans want this to happen.
Yeah.
And so you're going to dangle it.
Right.
And so it's a similar thing with like, you know, I think people are still learning as well that when you do representation, we do like it when you just say, when you are overt, like the kind of subtle indications are still like, you know, we see that with like, oh, it doesn't matter because it's not their whole identity. I'm like, yeah, sure. But like, you can still use the word, you know? And I think that's why it's been, so I remember like, it's only been very recently, but I remember finding out that Entraptor, who's a character on not on Steven Universe, on She-Ra, and she's like, she loves robots and she only eats tiny food. Like the food has to be tiny. And she just follows people very literally. And then everyone gets annoyed at her a lot. But over the course of the show, she doesn't change, but people realize that she doesn't have to change. And that's the kind of journey that she goes on. And when I read that she was actually autistic, I just burst into tears because I was just like, oh, I thought I could see that. And they did that deliberately. And that means so much. And then one step up, I watched this online live show called Dimension 20, which is like a Dungeons and Dragons live game. And one of the characters in there, like one of the non-playable characters who ran this big library, was like, you know, the guy's like, she's autistic. And like he kind of like, and she was a very interesting, like intelligent person who was like, you know, also like didn't understand social cues and was very blunt, but also very worried about getting it wrong. Like, did I get this right? Did I do that right? Am I correct in assuming this is what you wanted from me? Okay, good, let's go. And just all these things that just felt so relatable. And so I think seeing that kind of representation where we get to, it's not a suffering story. It's not a story about how hard it is to live our lives. And it's just about the fact that we live lives and this is a part of them.
Exactly.
It means it changes. It really does change things.
It's like
sorry.
No, I was going to say it's like on the L Word Generation Q with that girl in the wheelchair, and I just love it that she's just there, and it's like it's not a huge storyline. It's just that she's there and that's it. And I'm just like, thank God that's, you know, someone like that. And even like, remember what was it called? The OA. Did you watch the OA?
No, I did not. I heard about it.
It's amazing. I was devastated. I was hoping that season 3 was coming out and that they were joking about being cut. But anyway, there's a woman in there and she's an English actress. I can't think of her name. But yeah, again, she's just in the storyline and she's fantastic. Like she's intelligent as hell and she's just in the storyline and it's not about a disability. And it's just seeing those kind of things. It's really exciting to see it and it not be a huge like, oh, you know, this is a character in a wheelchair or, you know, for whatever. It just is and it's normalized and it's just wonderful to see.
No, I did notice that we both made a point of saying that the character portrayals were intelligent, and I was kind of like, it's that sense, isn't it? It's still like there's still that like it's tricky. I always think of like, you know, Forrest Gump and like that idea I feel like that became the pretty big standard for what a lot of disability representation that was seen as wholesome was. And I think as well, like a lot of the time our intellect is what we have to prize ourselves on because it's the one part of us that's considered to be productive and sellable. And I guess like I'm still trying to check myself about when I'm too focused on intelligence as a way of proving my worth to people.
I've done that before, right? Yeah, absolutely.
It's so hard. Like often because it feels like the minute that you mention any kind of disability, you then have to quickly prove that you're very capable, like very quickly prove that you're capable. And to disprove any doubts, it's just, it's a tie. It's a lot of just kind of trying to juggle and guess the assumptions someone's might be making of you, and what you have to do to counteract it. And I think as someone who, like, I used to get told a lot that I don't seem autistic, and or that I must be very, very high functioning, and all that kind of stuff, which is really common. And I think people kind of mistake like I have, like, maybe I have support needs that are met because I have supportive parents, but like I have support needs, and if they're not met, then my life does not function very well. And but there's that sense of like, oh, if I can be like a good conversationalist, you know, then people assume that I'm totally fine across all aspects of my life because I've proven to them that I'm enough like them that they can't imagine anything else happening. And I think there's that sense of also trying to remove me from the autistic thing. It's like, oh, but you seem like someone who I could like know very well. I'm like, yes, you probably know autistic people. We are everywhere. And I think there's that sense of, particularly when you have an invisible disability, you know, that people just kind of will try and find ways to reduce it, or like, before I was I was autistic, I was just really weird. And then when I say I'm autistic, they're like, oh, you're really normal. I'm like, you didn't think I was normal before I was diagnosed. Don't think I'm normal now.
Like talking about like that intelligence side of things, when I was in high school, because of the subjects that I had to choose, I wanted to choose other subjects and was told, no, you're not going to get the assistance if you choose those subjects because they're not subjects that will get you into the career that you'll be doing. Let's not go there. But anyway, so my TER was the second lowest in all of year 12. So I ended up, and so I assumed that I was dumb as shit. And then when I was at that time when I got sick and I was working, I decided to enroll in uni. And so I enrolled just with a Bachelor of Arts, and at a mature age picked up philosophy because that was always something that interested me. And that's when I found anthropology as an elective. And I remember I got a D, and I was doing it off campus. I got the D in the mail. I read the D, it was in red, and I cried because I thought, oh my God, I've got a D. You know, like D as in high school. And then I found out the D means distinction. I'm just like, whoa, okay.
Really well.
And then and so it wasn't that I was just doing really well, because I love the subject as well. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that if I get onto the topic of anthropology, I won't shut up because I just love it so much. But so for me to finally have achieved that, it really sort of it came part of my identity because of the fact that it's like, oh my God, I found something that I'm good at. And
well, I think it was having those external confirmation that you're good at something, because often, like, I find like I still really, I want validation. Like, I want to know that I'm doing it right, or that I'm good at something, because I don't necessarily trust my own instincts on that anymore, because I assume I'm terrible at everything. Like, I do assume that about most things that I do.
Same here.
And I think it's that sense of like, a part of, honestly, and like maybe this is going a little bit of a tangent, a part of disability support is positive validation, because we will assume that we are not doing a good job because that's kind of the feedback we've been getting for most of our lives. And I think like it's that sense of like, it's instantly we're just like, hey, can you just tell us that we're good? Can you just tell us that we're good every now and again? We just have like a sense of, by the way, doing a great job. Like, I would love that. Like, it would be so nice. But like, I think, it's that. I'm thank you for sharing that story. That's really sweet.
It reminds me of, like, I feel like I'm Lisa Simpson. Remember that episode where she's like, she couldn't go to school, and then so she's following the mum around going, please validate me. I was like, you know, can you? And that's totally. That has totally been me. I mean, in these last couple of years starting the business, I've moved away from that, which is good. Like I can't, when I look back at who I was, and now I'm just like, it's surprising to see the difference. But totally, that was me.
But like, I think that's like a part of why I really encourage anyone who's listening to find ways to like get involved with like local peer groups and stuff, because I think I started advocacy because I had a very low sense of self-worth. And if I couldn't fight for myself, I could fight for people like me, because I felt very strongly about that. And over time, that led to me having a stronger sense of self-respect, because, you know, you reach a certain point where you're just like, I can't, it is illogical to have all these beliefs that apply to everyone I know except for myself. You know, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And I think as well, when you know that you're doing things for your communities, it does kind of make you feel more confident to be in them. Like as a bi person, it can feel weird going into spaces that are quite gay and quite like, or like lesbian. So like there's a lot of, I've been questioned since I was like 16 about if I should be allowed to go into spaces or if people would actually date me because I was bisexual.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's just,
that's an interesting debate.
It is. It's just like people really believe that gender is the ultimate thing around attraction. That's what's been policed about attraction so much, right? It was about the gender of your partner and who you were having sex with. And when you're a bisexual person, unless you're polyamorous, that's one person. And so the fact that you could have like attraction to more than one gender, that then you're dating someone. So it doesn't mean you always want someone. And also we still just really struggle as a society to raise people to believe that you can be friends with genders that you have the potential to feel attraction to without it being like, you know, we have like, you see people like having fake weddings for their 6-year-olds because a girl is good friends with a boy. They go, let's get them married. They're going to get married. It's like this idea that, you know, if you're with someone of a gender you might have attraction to, you will be attracted to them. And so that's why bisexual people can never have any friends because we're just attracted to everybody all the time, constantly. We're not. But you know, it was by doing work around bisexuality, by doing like the podcast that I do and the show I do, and by doing advocacy and talking about it and doing some general awareness raising, and also by getting to like be trusted and to see a lot of people in like a lot of BIPOC people start to open up in like Facebook groups and in other like online spaces around how they were feeling about what our experiences were like. It meant that if I was being questioned in spaces that I went to, I no longer felt like that was a problem that I had. I felt it was a problem that they had. So if someone's just like, oh, but do bisexual people really stick around? I'm like, I don't care. Like well, probably not with you if that's how you talk to us. Like, you know, maybe not. But it no longer felt like I should be ashamed and leave. It made me annoyed, but it didn't make me feel ashamed or like I was intruding. And I think that was a lot of through just doing volunteer work. And I think like also it feels good to give, you know, do acts of kindness and acts of generosity have a positive impact on the person who receives them, on the person who makes them, and anyone who observes the act. You know, it makes us feel better about people in general. And so I think like practicing generosity doesn't need to mean that we, you know, that we kind of are overly thankful for people doing the bare minimum. It does mean that we get to appreciate the things that we do have in our lives. And I think that's a really important thing that I also learned from doing a lot of work in peer spaces and having connections to people who, you know, we have these intrinsic life experiences in common, whether it's being bi, whether it's being non-binary, whether it's being autistic, whether it's being a huge nerd and playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. You know, it's nice to have those kind of points of commonality.
Yeah, I have to think, talking about like representation, like in just going into all of this, did you watch Schitt's Creek?
I did watch Schitt's Creek.
Oh my God.
Oh my gosh. I watched it twice. I watched it by myself, then I watched it with my parents.
Oh, okay. Now I'm going to start getting...
It was very special.
Oh, I could not stop crying. I couldn't believe that this show would make me laugh, would make me cry. And what I loved about it was how it explained things. It explained things so well. I feel like it really, for me, like, you know, because these are topics that, you know, I'm still trying to get my head around because I'm not in that space. So like having
like the wine and the label kind of conversation.
And
it was very good.
But was that the one where Johnny was sitting down with I can't think of the guy's name.
The mayor?
Yes, and he's explaining about his son being pansexual.
Yeah.
That was like, for me, listening to that, like seeing that, I thought that is it was the best way to explain. I feel like the best way to explain it. And it just sort of made everything, I mean, obviously I'm not being, excuse me, got a cord wrapped around me now. It was such a great educational
what was really
piece.
Special, I think what was really special about Schitt's Creek in how it did LGBTIQ inclusion was that it provided a look into a world where there was never any pain because somebody was queer.
Yes.
Like it showed that they had maybe gone through some, like David had a lot of anxiety problems.
Yeah.
They had a lot of issues with friendship, and then obviously had some shitty relationships. But so had Alexa. So it wasn't like just because he was a pansexual guy. And also, I think what really struck me, and I'm going to get emotional about it, was like, you know, showing the coming out story of someone who realizes that they're gay or bi later in life.
Yeah.
And still, and that kind of, but also that fear, which I think people don't really understand very well, that we can be very sure our parents will be supportive of us, but there is still a chance that, but the fact is that we also know that when you come out as an LGBTI, when you come out as gay, as bi, as trans, there is a chance that love will become conditional. Yeah. And I think that fear is so real, because there's always that sense of, what if it doesn't go the way I want it to go? Because that like there is and I think when you live with a chance of being rejected by, when you grow up knowing that love will never be unconditional, or it might never be unconditional for you, it does a lot of stuff to your senses of, you know, love yourself and trust and worth and judgment and fear and anxieties. And so I think the way that they handled that story, that made me cry so much. It just not just because Patrick's parents look a lot like my own parents, but like there was like just like, I think the way that they would just his fear and how they articulated why he was afraid, I think that kind of captured a moment that hasn't really been discussed outside of queer spaces. And it also kind of showed what you want the reaction to be. And I think I remember when I was watching it with Mum, and there's a scene where David and Stevie, his friend from the store, who's like, you know, who's a woman, like they both are looking at the same guy, and the guy, and they're both sure that this guy's flirting with them. And then David goes outside with him, and my mum was just like, oh no, is something horrible going to happen? You know, is someone going to bash David up? Is this going to be a prank? Because for her, and you know, that was something that she was afraid of happening, because it's what she'd seen before and what we'd lived through with my brother being gay and my own experiences, right? And so the fact that didn't happen, the fact that at no point did that happen, that you could actually release that kind of slight tension you had of, are they going to make this painful for us? And I think, but that just showed, again, it's that sense of, it was a plot point, it was a minor one. What was important was the relationship and the people, and these are parts of who they were as people. And I want that for us as well. I want people with disabilities. I want us to, I want people to see what it would be like if we lived in a world where this wasn't such a fucking big deal.
That's what that's the thing I loved about it. It wasn't a big deal. It was just, that's what it was. And
are you crying? Because I'm gonna make me cry.
I am, because the next thing I'm thinking about was okay, because like I'm a nerd as well. 12 Monkeys. Did you watch that? The TV series. Okay, so the movie 12 Monkeys is a TV series, 12 Monkeys, and I'm just trying to gather my thoughts right now.
It's okay.
Okay, I've totally blanked on her name, and I feel horrible right now. But the girl who played Stevie in Emily Hampshire. Okay, Emily Hampshire, she played a character in 12 Monkeys, and it was amazing. So anything that she does from now on, I can't stop watching. But so when I saw, like, so I watched like Patrick and now what's his name? I'm thinking Dan, because that was
David,
so Patrick and David, when they did that thing in the shop where they sang, like, oh my god, that got me in tears. But then, like, after it had finished, that final episode where they all sat around the table and read the letters about what it meant to people,
the little documentary where they had like the mums kind of all writing, and I think that was a part of it. It was, and it's about hope, right? It's about seeing a version of the world that assures us that there is a positive, that we can't. So I'm also, you're making me cry now.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm a big crier. But I think that was exactly it. It's so important for us, but I can see why, if you're raising kids, like why you would want to know that there are people who are saying, here's what the world can be, because that's what you want your kids to have. And I think it's the same, like that's what we want to have. And I find like, you know, it's what we and I think that can also be the source of anger. Anger for me often comes because I know we can do better. Like I know that we are capable, because I've seen it and I've lived it and I've been part of it and I've witnessed it in other spaces. I know we can get accessibility right if we try. I know we can, like, you know, really rethink how we instantly think of disabled in our own minds. Like, I know that these things are all entirely possible, and that's the hardest thing sometimes, because
isn't it?
Weight can just feel, it's excruciating just to be
because
like, we can do better than this.
And how do you explain, this is my thing, how do you explain it to everybody else that it can be done? It's like, because like they think that because we get, and I harp on this, I talk about accessibility, because everyone goes, oh, there's ramps and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, yeah, sure, you can get into places, but that's not what accessibility is. Like, it's just so much more. And how do you explain to people what it is? Like,
well, it's that sense of like understanding that accessibility is allowing people, like all people, to be able to participate fully, without impediment. And I think to fully understand that, it's like, okay, so I could go to this one thing, but when you think of disability, and I think a part of it is because I often think of, like, how the sign for disability is person in a wheelchair, right? It's one of the most visual cues for disability. And so then you kind of like, when you start to say, cool, I need you to turn the lights off for me. And they're like, what? Like, why? I'm like, because I'm very sensitive to sensory. I've got a lot of sensory sensitivities, and overhead direct fluorescent lighting it'll take my brain a significant amount of power to continue to process without that just taking up most of my mind. And cause me a lot of distress. And they go, well, it's just a light. I'm like, yes, but it's just a ramp. The idea is that these are the fill-in spaces. And I think accessibility is tricky, because like people also like will kind of ask individuals to be like, well, you're like, you do this, like you're someone with a disability, what should we do in this case? I'm like, this is my disability. If you want a broad assessment, you need to pay people.
Yes.
Time. And that's a whole other thing. Like, don't even get me freaking started on people not thinking that we're worth time or money.
How many times I've been asked, I'm like, I just
ask you things for free. It's really bizarre, like how there's that assumption of our time and our work. And like, I'm not a huge fan of capitalism in a general sense, because again, any system that derives our worthiness to access, like, to live based on how productive we are, and based on and who decides what's valuable in these societies, it's never empathy. Like, they tend to, like, it's not a great system, but it's also that sense of, in that system, the fact that the work and time and skills of people with disabilities being so massively just devalued from the get-go is difficult, because there's still a lot of us who will do work for free because we don't necessarily, like, we're just happy to have an opportunity. And it's that sense of also us recognizing how we can, what people don't, they've shown, like, this, I think it's the Chivas Royal, like, experiment, where it was a cheapish whiskey. They raised the price. They priced it like a luxury good, and it sold better. People do value things when they pay for them. And if they don't want to pay you, it means that they are just like, well, why, we don't need to. And I found that, like, I think it also just sets precedent for, like, what we're worth.
And what really we think we're worth. Like, that's another thing.
And also how much time it takes, like, to talk about accessibility. We have to unpack the barriers we've faced in our own lives. We have to unpack them and examine them. And often a lot of these things are traumatic, but we have to examine them and do that, and then look at the systemic issues that have created those barriers, find evidence to back them up, to learn how to articulate to people who don't have the same lived experience in a way that they will still emotionally engage with and respond to. That takes a huge amount of time and effort and skill. And so it's not like, it's not just like if they expect us to know a lot, they don't understand that for us to know all that, we've done a lot of work.
And and I've faced as well, like, people, I'll start sharing certain things, but they want to know more, but they want to know more for free. And it's like that. And then when you sort of broach the subject about paying, you're kind of like treated like, oh, well, you're a bitch, aren't you? Like, that's
there is like the level of, like, why would we pay you? Pay you? It's like, well, like because like this is stuff that I've looked into for you. This is my time. Like, But I think it's that sense of, because we need them to take it on to survive. There's that sense of like, well, you want this to happen. I'm like, yes, I do want it to happen.
Yes.
But, the issue is that, that means you're blackmailing me, and that's not fun either.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky space. It's a tricky space. I think the effort of needing to like humanize ourselves, but also have self-respect, it's really hard. Yeah, I think, but it's also, I think, going back to what I was saying before about how do you convince people it's getting better, I think it's that sense of the more that we know about where we've come from, like we're short-minded, like when it comes to our own senses of history. And I think, like, the more that we're aware of the progress that's been made, the more we can actually understand and appreciate the continuous nature of that progress. And
yes.
that, much like when you're in a car that's moving very fast, you don't feel like you're moving fast, unless, especially when you're looking straight ahead, because you just see the road looks the same. It's until you look back and be like, oh, we've come a really long way, that you can actually appreciate where we've come from. And I think, the fact that we can have these discussions now, the fact that disability consultation is a thing, the fact that like, when you look at what was happening in like even just the 70s, in the 90s, like my diagnosis was missed, but the understanding of autism was not the same. And I wouldn't have been diagnosed under the current diagnostic criteria and stuff, So it's just that, it's that weird sense of like, it is getting easier, or at least it's getting better. And but that is because we are working very, very hard. And so and I think that the more people kind of can see that and feel empowered in themselves, that they are like, the more people with disabilities know that they are worth standing up for and advocating for themselves, the more that we actually as individuals say, no, I do deserve better than this, and I deserve respect. And I think that, the more that people recognize that's a problem. I think back of how, with the LGBTIQ community, it wasn't until the gaps, like how quickly that changed, like in 2005 or whatever, when 2007, whenever John Howard changed the marriage law to explicitly make it a crime, or not a crime, but illegal for people of the same gender to be married, which was like done in like when I was in high school. And people were just like, oh, look, we're not going to see marriage equality for years. And then like by, and even in like 2004, I think, or 2000, like when like a marriage equality, the groups were starting and the protests were starting, people were just like, it's never going to happen. Within 5 years, they're like, why hasn't it happened? This is ridiculous. Like it's incredible how quickly our sense of what should be can change when we are exposed to people who reveal the unfairness that they have to deal with in their lives. And I think, so as much as that's frustrating and exhausting, and at times really, disappointing, because that sense of like the Black Lives Matter rallies were just that big reminder. People have shared pain over and over and over again, and there still hasn't been enough systemic action because, but I think the same with this, there is progress being made in disability rights. I just, we are protected under the Human Rights Charter. There is just, I think we have to empower but what I think needs to happen is our own community's resilience building and empowerment. And I think we should be supported in that. And it should be seen as a priority by a lot of disability organizations. Because they're all like, oh, community connections on the NDIS. I'm like, yeah, but connection with what community? Like, I want to connect with other people. And sometimes it will just be to sit around and trash out the NDIS. But I think our abilities to advocate become a lot stronger when we get to remember that we're not alone. And that, I always think about how women are much more likely to report sexual assault if there's a fear that the person will hurt somebody else.
Okay, wow.
And I think about that a lot when it comes to advocacy. It's much easier for us to stand up when somebody else like us is being hurt. And I think the more that we can recognize that by saying, or by being more like, by doing the work to being able to say, I'm a person with disability, or I'm a disabled person, and I do deserve better. I think the better. There are a lot of incredible activists to be like, you can follow on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, on Facebook. There's a lot of really incredible people who have helped me a lot in just really shoring up that it's okay that not only is it okay, like it's okay to be angry sometimes, it's okay to be disgruntled. It's okay to there are so many problems, and that we can and should be doing better. Also that we are getting there, and that the more of us that are pushing, the faster it happens. And that if people aren't sure of how to start, that's gotten easier too, because of social media and the internet and everything. So I really recommend people use like those channels to kind of start to join community groups and start to really do reading and understand, like, the histories happening there. Like, I've learned a lot around like just the deaf history, and when sign language was basically banned in certain spaces for the 1800s. Yeah, which meant that like people like that, a lot of deaf teachers were suddenly out of work, and so it was a huge fight to get Auslan reinstated as a recognized language. But even now, in Victoria, which has a human rights charter, like culture is like I was talking about, like, well, what about deaf culture? And they're like, well, it has to have a language. I'm like, deaf culture has a language. Why is this not defined as culture? And this is. And I think it's just that sense of, that's just one example, but I think there's autistic culture as well. But I think and wheelchair culture, like we have cultures, we have like histories, and like, and even just like trends and everything, and lingo and language. But I think having those things really recognized as like legitimate and authentic and relevant is still like, it still seems a very niche space. And I think that sense of, if you want to learn like about humanity, you need to learn about all kinds of people.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's like, I've been waffling on for ages. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just thinking, like, talking about, like, as you remember how you're talking about like having those motivational speakers come in and talk about disability for disability awareness kind of thing. I think what really needs to happen is, disability awareness needs to have those people coming in, talk about some of that stuff, but needs to be around that whole thing about like, not disability awareness of what a person can do, but disability awareness about what's been happening, and as a society where it's all situated. I think that's where disability awareness has failed. It really needs to sort of have that, so people understand it and understand where we're coming from more, and so that we won't have to get so bloody angry when we're,
Oh, I think advocacy is always about being a bit angry. Like, if we weren't angry, we wouldn't have any fuel. Like, anger is what tells us things aren't right yet. It's like But I think it's also like, get angry, then get organized, and don't use that anger on people around you, and recognize that anger is systemic structures, and it's occasionally individuals, but it's mostly structural.
That's it. Yeah, I find myself getting angry at people when they say things, and then I'm just like, I've got to stop that, because it's not that their fault, it's what they've been taught it's okay to say.
And I think it's like, it's that sense of also recognizing that a lot of reporting and stuff is generated on making us feel outraged, and so acting on the outrage, it's what we're being programmed to do. But if you can take a second and think like, that's frustrating, and that's really frustrating, and I'm sad about it, because it means that you don't know yet, and that means that you're not doing the right thing yet, and like, there's a sense of like, honoring the feeling without kind of acting on it. It's hard, and it's hard to do all of that work all the time. And I think that's part of, like, I just saw an article now about how Victorian prisoners with intellectual disabilities are facing internal disciplinary hearings and receiving punishments without special support. So they don't know what's happened or why it's happening. And that's because so I just read that, and my feelings are, I'm getting worked up about it. And but I'm also just like, and that's because the coronavirus pandemic has made advocacy harder. People feel like it's not important. But the outcomes of that are really horrifying, because a lot of people with intellectual disabilities are massively over-policed. And so, it's that sense of, that's frustrating. But me just looking at that and wanting to like, or rip things to shreds, or just flip over my desk, I have to kind of keep breathing through it and read what's happening, like, kind of like figure out what I need, if I should do something with this information, if I should be sharing it, if I should be contacting somebody. And I can't do that if my first response is to yell.
Yes. Yeah.
And is that fair? No, I want to yell. That would be nice. But and I don't know, I'm not sure if that's a helpful thing to say though, because it's that sense of like, don't feel angry. No, feel angry. Be furious.
I think people. It's funny. I've got I've got a list of blog articles that I want to write, and one is about the angry disabled person, because as soon as you get angry as a disabled person, it's like, I'll just everyone will be like, just get over it, that's the kind of attitude that I've copped, just get over it. And it's like, well, we're angry for a reason, and I remember like before I got into all of this, and this was when I was internally ableist, I'd be like, oh, I don't want to be like those angry disabled people, but now I am, because I understand what the hell disabled people were going through.
Oh, like that's the feminist thing, right? Like, I don't want to be an angry feminist. I don't want to be like one of those angry, just like, oh, I am. And like, if you're not angry, it's because I think it's difficult. Like because I think there are a lot of things that getting in touch with the disability community and being autistic that I love about myself and love about my life.
Yes.
So I try and hold that balance too, because I think if you don't, it can get really depressing. And also it can, like, burn me up a bunch. Like, I can burn out, I can get really cynical. I can find it really hard to see any like hope or any positivity or feel any gratitude. And I think that's usually a big sign for me that I need to ease up a bit, because it can be, there is so much to do, and it is happening at a rate that is not ideal. But I think, I was told by a friend of mine that, it's so important that we don't martyr ourselves as well, because that's also kind of what people expect from us in so many ways. And so I think, like, it's easy to fall into that narrative because it's such a strong one, that, we kind of that we have to work so hard to prove that we're worthy. And we are worthy. We are intrinsically worthy. And like, and it's hard when you have to prove that to other people, but I think when you know that yourself, or at least when you know that you should know it, because I don't always feel like I'm a worthy person. I'm just aware intellectually that when I'm not feeling like that, I shouldn't be acting on that.
Yes.
It's not. And like, that's taken a long time. Like, I mean, in some ways lockdowns helped, like over 100 days of lockdown, such a long time. Like a lot of introspection, a lot of meditation, because I had a lot of stress and a lot of feeling overwhelmed, and really recognizing that I have to, that we have to kind of be able to be in tune with when, like, our own, like, I can feel like I am no good, or I can feel like I'm not doing enough, or that I have let things go. But it doesn't mean but then it's a matter of feeling that and recognizing that feeling in myself, but not necessarily then continuing to push myself into exhaustion. It's just that sense of actually just being like, my therapist once told me to look at it like, my brain is a boardroom. Like that movie Inside Out, where you had like the happy and sad and disgust and fear and anger, and the people pushing the emotional circuit board. It's like that, but like anxiety or kind of, self-criticism is one voice at the table, and they're there to give you your risk analysis. They're there to point out all the potential things that could go wrong. And they are there to do that to protect you. It's just that they want, and it's that sense of recognizing, rather than just be like, well, I guess we'll just let them talk for the whole meeting and tell us all the ways that I could mess this up. They're like, thank you so much for your report. I really appreciate that. We're going to listen to some other voices now. Thank you. Thank you, anxiety. Thank you, self-deprecation. That was great. Next up, we've got optimism. Optimism, the floor is yours. Thank you. And like, it's just that little trick. It's just that way of kind of recognizing that that is not the only voice in my head. And it's a...
Oh, wow. Yeah. This has been so fascinating. I just like there's like so many things I'd still love to go on about, but I wanted to ask you, that I ask every guest, is the 10 things that you'd like people to know about disability, and I'd love to know what your 10 things are.
I think I've touched on a base of them, but let's see if I can quickly pull up. Oh gosh, I had some notes. Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, so I think the first one was that for people to know that people are used to not thinking about people with disabilities. It's very natural. It's not in the way we are socialized to not think about us. So you have to be conscious that, you have to make a conscious effort to remember. And I think that's like, you've got to retrain yourself, because the way that you've been trained is wrong for us. It's wrong for us too. But just that sense of, we've all been trained to not think about people with disabilities. My internet connection's unstable. I hate when that happens.
No, it's all right. That was mine.
Also, my other thing is, like, many disabilities are not going to show up physically, and so don't assume people, when they ask for, like, if people ask for accommodations, assume that they are telling you the truth as a matter of course. Don't assume that they are making it up or trying to find an easy way out just because you see someone that looks like you and assume that they should be able to do everything that you can do. Also, our lives are not inherently tragic or inspirational. We all have personal tragedy and personal inspiration, like every other human being on the planet. That's just life. But our lives are not inherently more tragic or more inspirational than anybody else's. Or at least they shouldn't be, you know?
Yeah, it's like, oh, look what you've overcome.
Yeah, well, it's like, yes, I've had to overcome so many things, but that just sucks because you put them there.
Yeah.
Also, access can seem overwhelming, but if you engage people with disabilities to work with you with it, it is not nearly as complicated a process as you think. It is in depth because it does involve, it's like, you know, it is a top to bottom kind of examination that needs to be done.
Yeah.
But it's not overwhelming because it's overwhelming because you don't know what you're doing. Find people who know what they're doing and then pay them for their time. And it will not seem like such an impossible task. People with disabilities are more than what you see of us in media, that is getting better. Also, people with disabilities are not all straight, they're not all white, they're not all cis, we're not all, some of us have an intersex variation, some of us come from different faiths, from different backgrounds. We exist everywhere, and we often have multiple identities that we coexist with, and disability is one of those identities. It might be the most visible one, it might be the least visible one, but it's still part of us, but as is everything else. And if you're only focused on someone's disability, then you're going to miss out on every other part of them, and you will not be able to help them very well or support them very well. People might not, another thing, disability, this is just a little awareness thing. The minister in charge of the National Insurance Scheme wrote a book called In the Footsteps of Jesus. So he's not a huge fan of a lot of people.
Sorry, what was the book that you wrote?
So people should just be aware of that in general, to wonder why the NDIS has a bit of a model. Oh,
excuse me, just having a little interruption. Sheldon, quiet. I'm sorry about that little interruption.
That's okay. That's okay. We're very loud.
Yeah. Oh, very startling.
Okay. That's okay.
What was the book that you were saying?
Oh, I'm just saying that the minister, Stuart Roberts, what's his name? Stuart Roberts, the minister who is in charge of both Centrelink and the NDIS, wrote a book called In the Footsteps of Jesus. So his fundamentalist beliefs involve, you know, the idea that people who are on Centrelink are bludgers, but also that people with disabilities, God made it that way, you know. And so he also is massively against sex workers for people on the NDIS scheme. And so that's his own view. So the point is, there is a deeply entrenched history of religious organizations with disability support, and it has drastically impacted on how people associate us with shame.
Yes.
And so there's something else to be aware of, that when for a long time it's been the churches that have been in charge of looking after people with disabilities, there's a lot of shame around sex, around being different or wrong, because, you know, shame is a big part of people who don't fit into God's plan, or don't live up to that kind of stuff, which is not ideal. But disability, 10 things to know. If you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. That's it. That's all you've done. We're all very different people, and disability is very different. Also, by the time someone's actually asking you for an access, we've already gone over it in our minds multiple times, have weighed up the pros and cons of asking, have considered if you are, like, what the chances are. So take it very seriously that we ask it all, and recognize that if we feel like if we're made to feel small or problematic or troublesome for asking, and we don't ask again, it's there's no trust anymore, basically.
Can I just interject there? Because I like to say, even though I work in I talk about accessibility, and that's the area I'm interested in as a person, like as an individual, I hate asking for that. I feel like I'm imposing or being an imposition. Yeah. So sorry, I just wanted to interesting. I can do it for other people, but having to do it for myself.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
Well, because I think, and like I've had one point where I asked if you could like change the lighting in a room, and the thing was just like, no, just like that kind of off the hand, brushing it off, because it was those few extra seconds of recognizing that, oh, Ruby's asking, Ruby's autistic, it might be a sensory thing, but they wasn't that, giving it that extra second to kind of place the context on it, instead of just being like, oh, they're just trying to get, like, that's just like, no, we can't fix that. Like, why would you ask? That's annoying and frustrating and distracting. And like, but again, like someone else jumped in and took care of it. But in that second, I was like, oh, you have just, I was scared to ask, and this is exactly why. So just recognize that by the time people have actually asked, it takes a lot of, self-advocacy is really, really hard, and takes a lot of energy and effort. So if someone is asking, or if someone is pointing out ways to make things more accessible, they're not the problem, basically. We're not the problem if we ask. And especially if we ask while giving you a list of ways to make it better, we're helping you as much as we possibly could.
Hell yeah.
But it can feel, and if you feel frustrated or defensive, that's fair, but don't act on that. Just take a second to know how you would feel if you had to ask something else. Oh, that's my next point. I think I'm on 6, maybe I'm on 7. We're going to say 7. If you don't like the idea of being disabled, then it means that you acknowledge that being disabled comes with a lot of problems. Most of those, by the way, are within your power to help fix. So
I love that one. I love that. Wow.
So if you find the idea of it so terrifying, maybe look into ways that would make it less terrifying, because we live like this, and there are ways to make our lives a lot easier. It's actually not as hard as you think. And that way it wouldn't be so scary for you, and you wouldn't try, and people wouldn't find, not you listener, you're fine. But it wouldn't be so scary for people to think about if they knew that it's very possible to have a great life with a disability.
Yeah.
I think another one is we need to be at the table. We 100% need to be at the table. You can't decide for us. Again, I keep on saying you. People, if any decisions that involving us, and actually decisions that involve broader community in general, should ensure that there are people with disabilities at those tables, and not just the person that you know, or someone that you know might know somebody who has at least enough ties to community, or at least enough understanding of different intersections to be able to, if you're going to just have one person, which you shouldn't because they can't speak, have 2 people. I'm just telling you how to do it right now. It's fine. You got to have at least 2 people, because if you just got one, then they can't put things forward without it just being a single experience that no one else on the table can relate to. So you got to have at least 2 people, 2 people with disabilities, ideally different disabilities, because they're all very, very different. And within that, we should definitely be involved in all decision making around ourselves, but also in decision making in general around broader community, because 1 in 5 is, it's 20% of the community is disabled.
Yes.
In general, 20% of Australia is disabled. So 20% of all politicians should be disabled. 20% of all people at round table should be disabled. It should be across the board. It's not, but just to give you an idea, that's the kind of numbers we're talking about. And finally, people with disabilities can and often do have sex. Some of them are not. Some folks are ace, are romantic, or unfortunately, some people don't get to have sex because people don't want to have sex with them, and that sucks. In which case, why having sex workers on the NDIS would be awesome, because sex workers do a lot of fantastic work for people with disabilities. And there are disabled sex workers, and they're also wonderful people. And particularly, my brain just went to one of my favorite friends who does work with the Scarlet Alliance, and is an autistic sex worker, and they're a very cool human. But we are not children. We are more vulnerable, but not just intrinsically. We're more vulnerable because of systemic problems. And that the combination of religious organizations having a big role in our care, as well as the Western kind of white Anglo culture of really not talking about sex and discomfort around sex in general, on top of people's general just really when you combine those 2 things, like when you combine our dislike of talking about sex, the society is generally having a big of an issue seeing people with disabilities as adults with agency, and when you add a lot of religious religious influence in how care is given, you do tend to have an intersection of shame and of also just of discomfort, and other people just being deeply uncomfortable, which I just think is important to recognize. If the idea of someone with disability having sex, and then includes people with intellectual disabilities, if the idea of people with intellectual disabilities having consensual sex makes you upset, wonder why, and if it's because you're thinking of people with disabilities as children, then understand that is pathologizing, and while some of us do require huge amounts of support and to be, and some of us, there are some people who I know who won't be having sex in their lives because they just don't have enough agency. And that's also important. But agency does not equal age. And someone doesn't have agency does not necessarily mean that they have the brain of a 6-year-old. No, they don't. They've got their brain of however many years they've been on this earth. Whether that's 40 years, 27 years, 18 years. It's not 6. It's their age. Don't be it's disrespectful. Finally, people with disabilities, we tend to take off less sick days than anybody else in the workforce. We tend to work way harder than a lot of other people. So be kind to ourselves. I think one of the most important things that we can do, and one of the most radical things we can do, is to understand ourselves and to ask what we need, but also to really believe that we deserve it.
Yes.
And that we deserve to take time off, and that we deserve to take breaks, and that often we can get feelings of worth through doing community-based work. But if we don't feel worthy when we're just in our own downtime as well, maybe we should find ways to shore that sense of worthiness up. And if it's not, and I think that's something that can really come through peer connection. It can also come through, supported counseling and therapy services. But yeah, there's a lot of really great peer support groups. I cannot. When I was diagnosed, I thought that, the things I was capable of, I felt like something in my life had gotten a lot smaller. When I look at where I am now and where I was before I was diagnosed, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, honestly. 100%. Because I could understand myself, and I could therefore know how to relate to people as myself. And I can make real connection with people. And I think that's something that it's why I do the work I do, because we do deserve better. We deserve a lot better. And that includes me, which sometimes feels weird, but we're pretty special. We've come a really long way. Finally thing is that we have a really great history that is worth looking into, and has been across a lot of different areas, and a lot of different people have our own histories. But also, if you're not following or involved with any social, if you use social media a lot, and you should definitely follow some people with disabilities and advocates in that area, because also it can be useful just to have things to send your friends when they ask you questions that you don't know how to answer, or that feel very intense. You can just be like, well, actually, there's a great little thread about this on this person's Twitter, so go read that and then come back to me, and that'll be great. And then put money in their Patreon if you've read their stuff, because that takes time and work. But yeah, I think being proud as a person with disabilities does not mean that you're proud of your disability. It means that you're proud of yourself.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important thing, because we all have a lot to be proud of.
Yeah. Wow. And even just this conversation, there are so many quotes things that you've said that I'm just like, oh my God, it makes complete sense. Things that that have been inside. Things that have been inside that I'm like, I've not been able to figure out how to say those things. And it's like, oh my God, that's it. So I'll be, amazing.
I'm so glad. I practice talking a lot. I feel that I had this interesting advantage of as someone who spent most of my life not being understood or misunderstanding, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I feel like having to constantly explain myself meant that I have gotten quite good at breaking concepts down to explain.
Yeah.
How do I explain what I'm going through right now? Let me just kind of put it in a context that is relatable.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been an interesting skill, but I'm honestly, I think that this podcast is such a lovely thing. I think we all deserve to be able to see and hear, particularly here. It's an auditory medium. It's really lovely to be able to hear different people from the communities talking, and just to kind of hear conversations between people with disabilities, not just us being interviewed by somebody else. Curious. I want to hear, just tell me more about what it's like to be in a wheelchair.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I've only, I guess, growing up, because of the whole spina bifida community thing, I've only known people in wheelchairs. So
yeah,
and so therefore, it's only since the NDIS getting started with advocacy around that I've started to meet people who have different conditions, I'll say. And it's been fascinating because of I've been sold stereotypes, we've all been sold stereotypes. So then actually speaking to people and seeing things for what they really are, that's just been, so it's a fascinating thing. So I've really,
it's isn't it? Because I think like, I remember though, I had that initial shock of just like, oh, I've been lied to, Oh, if I look up at the Wikipedia article of Asperger's, it says we haven't got a sense of humor. That's bullshit. I'm hilarious. Like stuff like that. I think it is really, it's true. And like, I feel that it is like, I am able to do what I do and to have the understandings I have because of the decades of work that have gone, like, I remember finding out that there was this essay written in 1993 called "Do Not Mourn for Us," and it was about an autistic person talking to parents about, why they why their sense of grief when they had an autistic child, like to understand where that came from and why it was kind of wrong.
Yeah.
And to me, to know that we were having these conversations in the 90s and earlier, but like just to see that sense of, it made me feel so proud of knowing that we have actually been saying this for a long time. This isn't new. This isn't a fad. We're still going on about this. And while it's hard, but like it means that the longer this has been going on, the bigger it gets. And I think it kind of, when you know that you're standing on something that's pretty secure, that it wasn't just like, that you're not the first person, that you're not going to be the last person, that you're just a part of what will be a push that will be going on for a very long time. I think it's not our work to finish, but neither is it ours to walk away from.
No, and that's it. I think a lot of people think, and I guess for me, there's been a bit of a lot of imposter syndrome in that. Even though I've got a disability, I've started talking about it. So why didn't I talk about it earlier? Because, well, obviously, and like it was the internal ableism that I didn't want to have a bar, so it didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then
I mean, I find we are very good at finding ways to make the world fit into our emotional realities, like I don't feel like I'm worthy a lot of the time. I am often able to create quite complicated justifications for that, whether it's because, oh, well, the only reason I'm here is because of my privilege. And that the thing is that sense of then of like nothing I've done that is being like rewarded or has been taken well is actually mine. That's all luck. And all that was really doing was justifying, was kind of making the world fit what I feel, which is often that I'm not good at things. So, it was that sense of that doesn't actually fit reality at all. I was just trying to find ways to make it fit. It's like the confirmation biases that we hear and talked about with stuff like climate change or any articles that we read. We're attracted to things that suit ourselves and like suit what we already believe. And when we've got disabilities, a lot of us don't believe that we don't really believe that we are as good as other people because we're not treated like we are. And so often we'll find ways to justify that on a personal way, being like, well, I'm just not as clever at that, or I'm just lucky, or I don't really know what I'm doing, and they're all going to discover I'm like, even though you've done all this time setting up your work and doing all this huge amounts of work to do this, there's still that sense of, well, I still have this feeling, so what are the new things I can use to prove that this feeling is real? And it's hard. It's really hard. Like, it's and I just think it's also that, like, if you're people with disabilities, like, we have to having self-respect in a world that still really does openly debate our right to exist is really hard. And to be, we have to be gentle with ourselves, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for joining me today. What I want to do. Oh no, it's been an amazing talk, and there's going to be so many things. So after I'm sure, because I'll be putting this up on YouTube so that the captions can go on. And I'm sure I'll be like, okay, I need to follow that up more. So I've got to ask you, where can people find you on social media and follow all your stuff?
Look, on social media, you can find me on Twitter at Ruby Susan. I think it's 29. But I don't post a lot about my stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Like but I think Ruby Susan 29 is probably the best place. Or you can follow me on Facebooks, which is Ruby. I think just Ruby Susan again. Oh my God, I'm not good at plugging myself. See, this is my own thing. I'm just like,
okay, well,
it's
podcast.
ruby.susan.60. And See, I'm better at that. You can find my podcast joy.org.au/triple bypass. You can also find us on Instagram at triple bypass joy and on Facebook at triple bypass. And it's every week. We're available on all streaming platforms. I think we sort of stuff out with Spotify. They were mad at us for a while, but I think we're good now. I think you can hear me be a quirky person there all the time, because I mention being autistic relatively regularly, but it's also just like I'm an autistic person talking, so at times it's awkward and quirky, and that's fine. It's all good. But yeah, and you can follow. My Facebook is ruby.susan.16. If you want to follow there, and I think as well, like if you want to understand like the work I'm doing, you can find out more about work that's happening in the LGBTIQ disability space by signing up to Pride Foundation Australia's newsletter, which you can do at their website, like proudfoundation.org.au. And you can also find out by, I think, in the next few months, you can find more stuff available through Thorn Harbour, which is the Victoria, or formerly the Victorian AIDS Council, and through the National LGBTIQ Health Alliance, and through Deacon's Sexuality and Disabilities Research Project, which is coming out. So check out Dr. Amy O'Shea as well, because and also Nathan Despot. They're both activists who are doing a lot of work in this space. But yeah, I think that's everything. I can send, also, it's happy, I know this, we're recording this on the 25th. It's Happy Ace Week, everybody.
Ooh. What's Ace?
My asexuals and aromantics and all in betweens.
Okay, yep.
Just a celebration to you. A lot of autistic folk are on the ACE spectrum, and so I always feel very strongly about making sure that that's a good shout out to have.
Absolutely. And can you please show your t-shirt? I've just remembered.
Yes. Okay, so it says #NoFilter. And my friend gave it to me after a lot of drunken jokes we had at the pub about how, well, her way of saying it, she goes, I love it, Ruby, I love it. It's just like you got no filter at all, just no filter. I'm like, yes, that's 100% what it is.
Yeah.
It was a nice example, I think, of equality in myself that I'd often really thought of something I had to overcome, like, you know, something that was going to hold me back or was going to stop me from making friends. Having friends that were like, no, we love this about you was a very revelationary thing to me. And I try to remember that people like that I can be extremely blunt sometimes.
I like that. I actually prefer people being honest.
Oh yeah, I prefer people to say what they mean. Subtext is very, very confusing. It's a hard time.
That's what I've always said, like, you know, neurotypicals, like we play all these weird like mind games and just it's wild. It's wild. Exhausting.
It's exhausting to understand. I find like I tend to look at it as like running things through a giant computer program and trying to factor in enough things about a person so I can pick up what the things are saying. Anyway, you know, that them's the breaks. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. So what I'll do is all your socials and details about podcasts, etc. I'll pop in the comments below. Excuse me. Start again. I'll pop it in the comments below this podcast when it goes live tomorrow. Yes, when it goes live. And other than that, no, that's it. So everybody, thank you for watching, and we'd love it if you leave your either like, comment, share this podcast, and leave comments in what you're thinking, what you think of the show, any questions that you might have for Ruby, and also for any guests that you might like to see on future episodes. And so thank you for watching, and thank you, Ruby, for being on.
No worries. Tell all your friends how cool we are.
Yes, absolutely. Tell us. Thank you. Thank you. All righty. Thank you so much.
No worries.